This means that the U.S. empire, which is based on the globe using the U.S. dollar, is disintegrating. Without that income that comes from being the global bank, you lose a huge amount of cash that comes into the coffers of Washington. And, it's a Ponzi scheme. And the Ponzi scheme only works if there's people constantly who believe in the Ponzi scheme and who support the Ponzi scheme. Once people realize this is a Ponzi scheme and they leave, the whole thing collapses. So the BRICS nations are getting aggressively off the dollar. Global usage of the dollar is plummeting rapidly, like at the end of any empire.
Today we have Max Keiser, discussing the looming economic crisis that has been building now for years, and believes that we're now months away from a catastrophic event. The collapse we're seeing of many countries' fiat money systems indicates that the situation is extremely dire. The recent inflation numbers are also a signal of these systems' instability and is surging as we speak. Keiser emphasizes that the repercussions are tangible. He criticizes the failed promises of economic growth through trickle-down economics, and says that we instead watched an abundance of money printing and misallocated investments, contributing to capital disappearance. This pattern, involving trillions of dollars, has fed into an elusive financial void controlled by major accounting firms. Keiser predicts a transition to a Bitcoin standard, accelerated by waves of bank failures. He says hundreds of banks are insolvent and sustained by dubious accounting methods, which will be put on display as we start seeing more banking collapses in the months ahead. Let's get right into the latest interview with Max Keiser, as he gives his market prediction and how Bitcoin will play a role in crypto, stocks, and financial markets worldwide.
What we're seeing now is that, of course, all that money ends up causing inflation, and then the inflation is bankrupting the middle class, and people are outraged, and they say, stop sending money to Ukraine. But to get more to the point, they should be protesting about getting rid of fiat money and adopting Bitcoin, as we do in El Salvador, and you too can enjoy the Salvadoran miracle. It's a circular Bitcoin economy. It's all in Bitcoin. I think in America, when you see outcry about money being sent to Ukraine, for example, well, the government prints the money. And no one's going to stop them. They can print it and ship it to Ukraine. You can just use Bitcoin your entire life in El Salvador if you want. The adoption rate is increasing every month, every year, but if you can do it now. So in Bitcoin Beach, my friend Mike Peterson of Bitcoin Beach, he started the Bitcoin revolution in El Zonte, El Salvador, and the circular economy in El Zonte. These guys would have to go 20 miles down the road to an ATM and try to get cash, and it was very cumbersome. But on a Bitcoin standard, it doesn't matter where you come from, or any country, any currency. If you have a Bitcoin, you can transact because the local commercial people take Bitcoin, and it's an instantaneous transaction, and there's nobody who's going to stop them. You cannot interrupt or censor. The center of freedom has moved from the U.S. to El Salvador. So this is what I'm telling people: leave the U.S. The U.S. is now at the back of the queue. They're no longer the shining city on the hill. That's like the U.S. is now the place to leave. It's the banana republic. When the President Bukele gave his recent speech to CPAC, he was talking about inflation in the U.S. and how America is now monetizing their own debt. America prints money to buy its own debt because nobody else in the world wants to buy American debt. It's called debt monetization. And back 50 years ago, people in the U.S. would look at Central America and say, ha ha, you have to buy your own debt. You're a banana republic. And so here you have the president of El Salvador lecturing people in Washington at CPAC about the fact that you guys are now monetizing your own debt. So it's the U.S. has a monopoly on this, and the U.S. is world reserve currency since World War II. It's like they kicked Iran off of SWIFT, and they sanctioned Russia and seized Russian assets. And so with your point is they've weaponized the dollar, which is a terrible thing to do because these countries are then motivated to come up with something other than the dollar.
Which is what BRICS is.
That's exactly what they're doing. So the BRICS nations are getting aggressively off the dollar. Global usage of the dollar is plummeting. And, this means that the U.S. empire, which is based on the globe using the U.S. dollar, is disintegrating. Without that income that comes from being the global bank, you lose a huge amount of cash that comes into the coffers of Washington. And, it's a Ponzi scheme. And the Ponzi scheme only works if there's people constantly who believe in the Ponzi scheme and who support the Ponzi scheme. Once people realize this is a Ponzi scheme and they leave, the whole thing collapses rapidly, like at the end of any empire. And that's not the stage we're at now. The U.S. empire, the U.S. dollar empire, is the last inning of a massive Ponzi scheme that's been going on for 50, 60 years. And when it collapses, it'll happen like building number 7. You know, it'll just be free falling in its own space. And everyone will wonder, how did that happen? It was so sudden. You know, they'll make up some excuses, but it'll be quick and devastating.
Keiser goes on to say that because of massive insolvency, central banks and the Federal Reserve are now over-leveraged. Japan has always been one of the top lenders globally because of its cheap money. This has led to Japan reaching into assets that have now crippled its infrastructure.
El Salvador is solving a big problem for America on the southern border. You know, their southern border is out of control. And they look at El Salvador and they notice that less and less Salvadorans are making the trip north. So they're actually loving President Bukele because he's helping them with a big problem that they have at the southern border, and they are now rooting for other countries to do the same, to follow in the Bukele model, and this would stem the number of migrants who are crossing the southern border. Number two, to your point, it is a struggle. You know, we are dealing with the IMF. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is, you know, John Perkins wrote about this in his Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which he worked for the bankers and the IMF. And when a Southern American country or Central American country did something that the bankers on Wall Street didn't like, they would send in the economic hitman, and they would, in fact, you know, throw them out of an airplane, the leader of that country, et cetera. And the history is replete with examples of this. It's not debated. This is exactly what they do and have been done. Today, we've got the IMF fulfilling that role. It's trying to get as many countries in the world to get on the U.S. dollar. You know, Donald Trump said last week that he's going to go after countries that stop using the dollar. And so they're very nervous. They're very nervous about the fact that the dollar is losing world reserve currency. There's nothing they can do about it. But, you know, with the IMF, President Bukele has pretty much gone toe to toe, let's say, with the IMF. And he's in the process now of exiting the IMF. So the economy is growing sufficiently without the IMF's help. Thank you very much. The balance sheet of the country, by the way, the balance sheet of El Salvador, the country has hundreds of millions of dollars, close to $1 billion in Bitcoin. They're putting Bitcoin on their reserves, which helps them grow outside of all this fiat money madness. So not only do they use it as day-to-day legal tender, but the country itself has put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. We have an adopting El Salvador passport program. People are sending us $1 million in donation to get a El Salvadoran passport within 2 weeks. And then that money goes into Bitcoin. We've got some other financial kind of architecting that's going on, which is favoring Bitcoin. So that not only is the country have Bitcoin as legal tender, but it'll become a fully reserved Bitcoin country, which means that it'll be potentially the richest country in the world, because in the fiat money madness, they're all throwing this. Let me tell you, El Salvador is the next Singapore. The GDP here is going to triple in the next, 5, 6, 7 years. This is the place to be, Jimmy. The U.S. is a fucking shithole. I mean, if you want to waste your time in that godforsaken hellhole, have at it. But if you want to be part of the revolution where people are optimistic and building the future, and there's economic freedom and freedom of speech, there's only one country in the world, and that's El Salvador.
Keiser points out that El Salvador has not defaulted on debts or experienced chaos, like the collapsing banks in the US and Europe. The Bank of Japan, historically central to global currency dynamics, is on the brink of default, which could precipitate a global economic downturn. Max foresees a looming economic catastrophe driven by collapsing fiat money systems, rampant inflation, and bank failures. He suggests that a transition to a Bitcoin standard might be on the horizon as the world grapples with the impending crisis. He asserts that the promises made by the Federal Reserve and central banks have been hollow, leading to excessive money printing and a proliferation of poor investments. And with the aftermath of the recent inflation surge, Keiser says this will not lead to a return to the status quo. He argues that the economy has spun out of control, with the US facing a mounting debt crisis. Keiser presents two bleak possibilities: hyperinflation, or a deflationary depression. In either scenario, the overall quality of life deteriorates. He notes the absence of viable solutions, indicating an even greater severity of the crisis. Interestingly, he points out how political figures are discussing Bitcoin as part of a potential solution, marking a shift towards a Bitcoin-centric financial framework. What do you think about the latest interview with Max Keiser? And what are your thoughts on his prediction for Bitcoin? Comment down below. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content just like this. We'll see you in the next video.